your time today.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to share what I believe is a very interesting case of how conservation can be achieved in communal property in the context of a biosphere reserve, which is the case in Mexico. So I will be focusing on the Monarch Conservation Fund and what the impact of that has been after approximately 14, 15 years of operation. So it is a fund that has been existing for some time now, and therefore we have information that we've been collecting through these years that I will be sharing, hoping that it might be of interest for other cases in Mexico and the world as we seek for solutions for conservation. So without further ado, I will start by sharing the location of the Biosphere Reserve. This is in central Mexico. Mexico is cut in half by what we call the neovolcanic axis, and it's the series of volcanoes that are the highest peaks in the country. So Mexico, as I was saying, is cut in half by this volcanic chain, and the Monarch Butterfly Reserve is in the middle of that. It's an area where monarch butterflies migrate to every year. They fly down from Canada, approximately 4,000 kilometers south, through a very interesting and unique biological process of a generation that lives around 6 months when butterflies normally only live about a month. So they do that in order to escape from the freezing cold of the north and reach our temperate mountains in Michoacan and the state of Mexico. So the reserve is shared by two states, but it is a biosphere reserve, so it is a federally managed area. So that makes it a little bit more complex. Can you see my screen there? I hope I pressed the right button now.
All good, perfect.
Good. Okay, so besides being a two-state reserve and a federal reserve at the same time, it is an area, like many other places and most of Mexico, owned by communities. After the Mexican Revolution, there was land distribution to the people and a governance figure established called ejido, and in some cases, community system. So this that you're seeing is the reserve, and in the finer lines, you can see all the communal property under this governance figure. So it's approximately 90 ejidos in the reserve, and in the darker areas where you see the black dots, that's the core areas of the reserve, and that's where the monarch butterfly hibernates. So we have the core zone and the buffer zone as any other biosphere reserve model. So we are talking of community managed forest. It's a temperate forest, basically fir, which is the preferred type of vegetation for the hibernation of the monarchs. And in some other areas, we have some pine and oak, but it's mainly fir. At an altitude of approximately 3,800 meters with a huge variability because it's a whole volcanic area. I'm sorry I'm presenting in Spanish, but never mind. Most of the rest of the presentation are images, so don't worry about this. I will narrate this. Basically, the origin and the problem that led to the establishment of the Monarch Fund was that the Biosphere Reserve was established back in the early 90s. But researchers found out that the monarch butterfly was hibernating in other areas outside of the reserve. So in the year 2000, there was a need to expand the polygon of the reserve, particularly the core zone, to incorporate within that all the monarch colonies. The problem was that there were already logging permits given to local communities owning those territories. So you can imagine the conflict of government, federal government saying, well, we have a decree, it's a presidential decree, and then communities being limited on their access to permits that they already had to extract volumes of wood from the new core zones of the reserve. So that led to a very intense conflict, and the solution was to find a way to work together, government, communities, and NGOs to find a solution. And the solution was the establishment of the fund, which led to a commitment by all these actors to find a way to help the communities that were being limited in their income by generating other means of income, but at the same time reaching an agreement that the communities would commit to avoid the deforestation and degradation of the area. So the way to do that was to offer a compensation equal to the amount of money that they would have obtained from selling the wood that they had already permits for through the fund. So price was established by cubic meter of wood. There was a extrapolation of that based on the permits, and an amount was reached saying we have to give this to the communities versus or against their commitment of conserving the forests. And we did that through a legal document where all the communities committed to this agreement. And of course, all of this was linked to very specific indicators of the state of the forest. So the agreement was, we will pay annually to these communities for 25 years, and that is also very important. There is a long-term vision of the payment for the communities. It's not a 1 year or 2 year thing. It's a 25-year agreement. And the payment goes if we can demonstrate scientifically that there was no deforestation year by year, which is what we've been doing since the year 2000 when this happened, or a little later when the fund was established. So World Wildlife Fund was very active together with the government in creating this and seeking the original capital and the original endowment to build the fund, which was obtained by the Packard Foundation from the US. And later on, there has been some donations, endowment donations from the government of Mexico, and very, very few funds, but also from the state of Michoacan. So it is a very interesting thing. And the whole fund is being managed by the Mexico Nature Conservation Fund, which was also originally established by WWF back in 1995. And a trust fund was established, managed by the fund, which is now Latin America's largest environmental fund. So they have a lot of experience in managing endowments. And we also made an agreement with scientists from the National University of Mexico for the monitoring aspect of the state of the forest. And all of this, of course, is being done in coordination with the reserve, with the National Commission for Protected Areas. So it's a very interesting case of partnership with communities, government, and civil society, but also with scientists. And I would finalize this slide also saying that all of this has also been accompanied by additional funding for productive projects for the communities around the area. That includes tourism, that includes sustainable use of wood, adding value so communities can enter the value chains of wood with some advantages, except just selling the tree trunks, etc. So that's the origin. That's the problem that we aimed to solve. There is a governance structure, as I said. I won't go too much into that, but basically the Protected Area Fund is a large fund that is also managed by the Mexico Conservation Fund, and within that, the Monarch Fund has been embedded. And the governance structure of the trust funds includes WWF and the Fondo Mexicano as the key responsible parties, but the trust fund management committee also includes representatives of the local communities, the governments, and the scientists. Underneath, you can see the logos of the different instances that participate. So the whole thing in theory sounds well. We already have the funds, we have the commitment of the communities, of the government, but then the challenge was, is this really working? Are the communities adhering to the agreement? And let me say that unfortunately this area was under enormous pressure for logging, legal and also illegal. And so we were facing a very difficult situation where illegality was very strong. WWF made a strong call to the government to enforce the state of law in the area. So we asked for the police, the federal police, the army to be present, to be able to act against illegal logging, because we understood and we were convinced that no matter whether we establish a fund and make these agreements, if there is no state of law, it is very difficult to work. So we did that, and then the monitoring came to be a very important part to demonstrate whether this is working or not. So what we've been doing once we have the endowment is we do aerial photography. This slide just shows you the routes that the airplane takes, taking very detailed photographs of the core zones of the reserve, so we can use that and monitor what is happening at a very fine level. Now, through the years, we have satellite imagery that we did not have in the early decade of the 2000s. Now we're also using satellite imagery, and what we do is basically we compare the images of the forest year by year. And there is a very specific methodology to do that the Institute of Biology of the University of Mexico applies. And here we can see, for example, one case of how we can see deforestation in the area, the comparison from one state to another in the forest in specific polygons that are applied for the analysis. So there you will see in red what is detected 1 year after the other in an area that in this case is alleged deforestation. And I say, or illegal logging, and I say alleged because what we also do is go and verify that in the field. This is another example of one of these cases, 1 year, the next year, and the alleged deforestation or illegal logging or very clear deforestation that we see in this case. After we do this analysis, we go to the field with the communities to verify why there was deforestation. There can be various causes for this. There can be winds, there can be rains, but there can also be illegal logging at different levels. We had a very bad case 2 years ago of winds that had a very big impact on the reserve, but unfortunately we've also had illegal logging in the area. I'm going a little bit fast because I know I'm constrained in time. These are just some examples of illegal logging cases in the reserve. And we generate a report every year with based on this analysis that we present to the Trust Fund Committee that includes the community. So it's very scientific. And in this table, you can see each one of the different community properties and in which we detected deforestation. So it is very open, it is very transparent. All of this is presented to the communities. They can see what is happening in their territory, which is also very useful for them. And finally, I want to present this graph, which basically is, okay, all this, is it working or not? And this is what has been happening since the year 2001. The levels of logging, of deforestation we had back in 2003, 2005 was reaching over 450 hectares of forest. At that rate, we would not have a biosphere reserve anymore. We can see that this trend began to diminish. This is, as I said, not only because of the Conservation Fund, but also because of the call for enforcement that we did and the presence of local authorities to deter illegal logging. But then you have to have both sides of the solution. In very recent, we can see this decline, and in different colors, we can also see in red what is illegal logging, what is deforestation for natural causes like winds, wildfires, and also some logging in order to control potential plagues of the trees of the forest. So in the year 2009, we had very little deforestation. We had a very strong storm, so there was a huge impact on the reserve. And then the next number of years, we have fortunately seen this very low presence of illegal logging. And in the year 2011 and 12, we could basically say that illegal logging had been eliminated in the reserve, in the core areas of the reserve. From then on, we have had an intermittent growth and reduction of illegal logging, but the good thing is that it has been kept checked, and illegal logging has not grown significantly in these past years. And last year, our monitoring showed that the illegal logging had decreased over 90% compared to the prior year. So it is an interesting case that shows how working with the communities, offering long-term financial solutions, accompanying the long-term financial solution with productive projects and a cooperation with governments can and of course the scientific monitoring of the whole thing can lead to positive results. So thank you very much for that. I think I'm still in time. We are, just to close, we are thinking of how this model can be applied in other areas. If we compare the millions of dollars that sometimes go for conservation and we cannot have very clear results or impacts measured, this was a $5 million investment in the endowment fund. I didn't say that, I think. And then it has grown to $7.2 million. So compared to the big amounts of money that are applied in many areas for conservation, I think this is a very, very interesting case of how money has been well invested. The value of the endowment of the capital has been maintained, and there is a long-term vision for the communities. And I will also add that the Monarch Fund payment for the communities has now been doubled by the National Forestry Commission, by through the National Forest Fund, and in the case of the communities of the state of Mexico, they are also they're actually tripling the compensation for the communities to make it more attractive. Closing, there are challenges ahead. This is a dynamic process. This is never static, as probably everybody knows. One of the challenges is we need to maintain the value of the payment for the communities to make it attractive, to keep it being attractive for them. But so far, we have a 15-year or over 15-year case that can show that even though in contexts of high illegality, complexity because of local land tenure, interstate situations and even federal oversight, there is a way to act and have concrete results. At the end, we are seeing, and this is not a graph in the presentation, but I would just mention that even though in Mexico we've been able to reduce the deforestation in the core zone and hibernating areas, unfortunately we are seeing an overall decline in the monarch butterfly northern population in the continent. Everybody knows monarchs are not endangered, are not an endangered species, but the migration phenomenon is. And the reason now is mainly probably because along the flyway of the monarch, they are encountering many challenges. One of them, the reduction of the milkweed because of the use of herbicides, mainly in the large agricultural areas of the US, reducing therefore the feeding and grounds for the monarchs. But that's a whole other discussion. So thank you very much. I will leave it there. I think I'm still in time.
Thank you very much, Jorge. That was very interesting and enlightening. I'd like to remind everybody to be writing down your questions that you have for Jorge, particularly around the fund mechanism and how the interesting case of the complex institutional environment in some cases not dictates but forms or guides the formation of the funding mechanism and how it gets implemented. When we have such prevalence of communal tenure around the globe, particularly in high biodiversity rich areas, figuring out how these mechanisms and solutions can contribute to biodiversity conservation is both a need and a great desire. So thank you again very much, Jorge, for your time and your expertise, and I'm sure we'll have some questions in the Q&A period. Moving on to Angus to speak to us about finance conservation in Namibia. You see the screen up, so that seems to be functioning. And I'll just do a brief introduction of Angus and then hand it off. So Angus Middleton is the Executive Director of the Namibia Nature Foundation. He has over 15 years of senior management and organizational leadership in Africa and Europe, and his experience has brought him a relevant mix of knowledge and technical expertise in environmental economics, ecological resource management, agricultural management, and biodiversity policies. At NNF, he provides overall leadership for the organization and also works directly on a number of projects, particularly in the field of environmental economics. Angus holds his master's in environmental policy, I think, from Imperial College in London, and a bachelor's in ecological resource management from University of Newcastle. Thank you and welcome, Angus. So we look forward to your talk. I should have mentioned earlier, Mexico is a BIOFIN country, and Namibia is in some ways a BIOFIN country, adapting and using the methodology for its uses with funding from other sources. So that's part of the dynamic here. Thanks very much, Angus.
Okay, thank you, and hello to everyone. So my talk, I should say, I think Andy, you gave a nice introduction at the end there, is that we are part of the BIOFIN process tangentially through the Ministry of Environment and Tourism and GIZ. We have a ResMob project which essentially focuses on using the BIOFIN methodology. The slides that will follow, there'll be a sort of smorgasbord of logos underneath because I'm bringing together different pieces of work to try and give a general overview of the topic. Financing conservation in Namibia. And this is really a different angle. This is focusing on unlocking private investment in communal areas where there are often rather high transaction costs. So, right, sorry, jumping around. So I'm going to give an overview quickly of biodiversity finance in Namibia to set the scene in terms of money for conservation. I will very briefly talk about community conservation. And at the end, I'll show a link that if anyone wants to follow up, they can follow up on that. I'll talk about some of the financial returns and then focus on the benefit flows. And then after that, I'll cover the financial viability of community conservation areas and then wrap up with a few short concluding words. So in terms of biodiversity finance and BIOFIN, the Namibian government, together with GIZ, conducted a biodiversity expenditure review in 2014, and that was recently updated. And the overall story is declining biodiversity expenditure. There's some underlying reasons for this, that partly Namibia, having been reclassified as an upper middle income country, has meant declining donor funds, and also the need for the state to shift funds towards primary services like health and education. The other reason is that more recently, the Namibian economy is strongly linked and coupled to the South African economy that's gone through a contraction, shall we say, and that's also affected Namibia. So overall, government finances are currently in a constrained period, and we've seen a decline in outside support. Towards the end of last year, we did a financial needs assessment, so a recosting of Namibia's NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, the second one. And again, here, the overall, it looked like the initial one, for various reasons, was undervalued in terms of budgeting, and the full implementation is a magnitude higher. And what we're busy with at the moment is looking at what the ministry and GIZ are busy with is looking at the Biodiversity Finance Plan. And part of that are some TEEP studies, which the Namibian Nature Foundation, together with partners, are looking into, and those should develop some instruments. Total biodiversity expenditure is slightly more than $1 billion a year, and we've already seen that this is projected to decline. Fortunately, the initial estimation of value of ecosystem services is that they exceed 13 billion a year. So there's clearly, on this basis, there's a case to be made. Of that, 5.2 billion, or about 1/3 of the total tourist spending, is attributed directly to nature. And then, and tourism includes photographic tourism as well as hunting. There hasn't been a decoupling of that. And then of that, more than 50% of all the ecosystem services are generated on communal land. So communal land is very, very important in the context of conservation in Namibia. And this just shows you the kind of increase in expenditure that will be required, the dotted line, which shows that effectively what you see there is the gap between what really should be spent on biodiversity and what currently is being spent on biodiversity. I think we'd all be having a happy day if we were to take that leap this year. Namibia's conservancies at a glance. So the first conservancies were established in 1998. The legislation was slow brewing in the 90s, came out mid-90s. First one's in 1998, and the movement has grown since then. What the conservancies are, they are state areas under communal management, under which the rights over wildlife have been devolved to these structures. But those rights come with responsibilities, and these are guided by national policy and standard operating procedures for conservancies. Following that, there was a structure for community forests under a different ministry, Ministry of Agriculture, but there's a strong collaboration, and they fall under the overall policy, and they have similar rights over forest and grazing. And more recently, we've worked with the Ministry of Fisheries to introduce fish protection areas for the inland waters, where communities have rights over fish resources. So you see these suite of rights that are devolved to conservancies. The conservancies, the whole movement relies on 3 pillars, which are supported by a range of partners, and NNF is only one and by no means the largest partner. And those are institutional governance to ensure that the conservancies meet their obligations, and there's some degree of equity and fairness. Business, enterprise, and livelihoods, and there's been a very, very strong focus in getting business and enterprise into these areas, and that's what I'll go into more detail on. And on and those rely, of course, on having sound natural resource management in place, particularly when you're talking about wildlife or in the context of forestry and forest products. So the bottom line is that this has been an incredibly successful program. And if you just look at the bar chart on the left, you see this incredible rise in protected areas. The green line underneath is state protected areas with a few steps. And the gray one is really where the growth has been happening. And the gray areas are the communal conservancies. And at the end of 2015, I think there were 82 conservancies. And this year, I think we're up to 85, and there's at least 10 that are asking to be gazetted. So that they understand the success and they want to be part of that. And those figures alone should give reason for celebration, because it covers some 165,000 square kilometers. It's nearly 20% of the land surface. It reaches some 10% of the rural population, and that's all rather significant. And at the same time, Namibia has had elephant populations go from 6,000 in the mid-90s to over 20,000, 22, 25,000 in the last counts over the last couple of years. It's the only country in the world with viable populations of free-ranging black rhino. All other black rhino are in protected areas behind fences. The ministry has an enlightened policy of stewardship and has given black rhino 2 conservancies in open landscapes to be co-managed. The lion population is probably one of the only countries in the world with an expanding range of lion, expanding quite rapidly out of Etosha, this is Etosha National Park, right up into the northwest, right down here. Driving what we're having to deal with at the moment is a lot of human-wildlife conflict as a result of that. And also lion up here and around here. So these are success stories that we're now having to grapple with some of the issues. But what about the money? And in the context of constrained resources, we need to see and understand what the returns are. And why, if there's already 83 conservancies, why are there 10 more in the pipeline that are clamoring to be involved, even in the face of rising human-wildlife conflict, driven by a number of factors that I won't go into. So in 2016, community conservation generated over 111 million Namibian dollars. The exchange rate at the moment is somewhere between 12 to 14 to the US dollar. There were 853 employees, 950 representatives receiving some sort of allowance and involved in the process. And tourism generated just over half of this, with 64 million, and from 38 conservancies that are directly involved in tourism activities. And that's also one of the challenges, is some conservancies have certain attributes and others don't. And what's very interesting in terms of donor support and programmatic sort of influence is that we currently live in a cycle of 2 to 3 year projects. And you see here very clearly that the initial investments and the transaction costs of getting communities involved in conservation were very, very high. And the returns were minuscule to start with. And it was only after around 10 years of very, very high investment that eventually at the turn of the millennium, 2002, it started to break even. And at that time, support was drawn down slightly. And you could see that the income continued to rise. And we've had peaks and troughs since then, but we've managed to maintain support. There are still transaction costs, they are considerable, But you can see that the annual contribution to the national economy, so this takes into account a number of multipliers, is very, very significant. And you can see that it gets higher and higher every year. And still on the back of this investment, which came largely through the Millennium Challenge account from the US, we anticipate that will continue to rise as a number of joint venture partnerships and operations that the communities will benefit from increasingly as they mature. And this is just a chart showing since inception, the economic rate of return that's been calculated and estimated with the net present value. So all, in terms of development metrics, all rather significant. But not every conservancy is the same, and they, as I mentioned earlier, they have different attributes that allow them to undertake certain choices in how they get their income. So these conservancies are earning significant amounts of money. Here you've got Tora Conservancy in the northwest of the country, very arid area, and they have benefited from being one of the early movers in '98. They managed to attract some very exclusive safari operators, including wilderness safaris. And as a result, they've got a very strong photographic safari business that brings in a significant portion of their revenue, with a very small amount from trophy hunting and game utilization. Muduva Nyangana, which is directly north in the context of Namibia, slightly more humid belts in the deciduous woodland area in Kavango region. Latecomer into the conservancies, not the most spectacular area, close to Cowden National Park, which has been underinvested and is more of a wilderness park, so not attracting high numbers. And their reliance has largely been in part on tourism, but also on hunting. Kasika over in the northwest, in the northeast, sorry, they're one of the ones that benefit hugely from tourism. And then Nainai, which is really in very less inspiring terminalia woodlands with not a lot of variety. They rely very, very heavily on hunting, and in particular, in their case, on trophy hunting of elephants. And you can see that the amounts they're earning is very significant. Nainai are also characterized by being, they are a San community, so amongst the most marginalized groups in Namibia. So from those benefits, what kind of disbursements do you get? And again, these differ depending on the conservancies. You can see that in Tora, there's high costs for running the conservancy, and most of those costs are linked to jobs that are created for game guards, conservancy managers, etc. Nainai, on the other hand, also because of the way that the social structures work, lower population, they distribute theirs more evenly in a way, and there's a strong focus on giving cash benefits to households. So if you remember, they were earning nearly 6 million, and by distributing nearly 2 million, they can realize a decent benefit at household level. And cash is often a restricting factor. And this gives you an overview of, or breakdown of where the different income comes from. So by far, joint venture tourism, largely photographic tourism, gives rise to nearly 54% of the benefits. But then hunting comprises of a number of these, together with some of these down here. And that comes close to the tourism, still under, slightly under, but around 48% in total. So the two are the main drivers of this community conservation. And above that, we need to understand how the benefits are distributed. So if you consider that the benefits go to the community. They're distributed through the Conservancy Committee. And within the community, there's livestock owners, there's a traditional authority, there's joint venture partnership and hunter who employ people, and then there are conservancy employees. And the red here signifies the ordinary members of the community who are part of the conservancy. So tourism brings about some degree of fees for the conservancy, and those go through to the committee, mainly based on bed nights. But there are other constructs as well. But by far the largest benefit that comes from tourism is in direct employment. But that means that only a handful of people will tangibly see the benefits of that, together with their extended families. Of the fees that go into the Conservancy Committee, generally most of them go towards conservancy operating costs and towards conservancy employees, with very, very little going into in as benefits and incentives to the wider community. Hunting generates a huge amount of fees, much more fees than tourism, and with trophy prices generally being widely advertised, there's a greater degree of transparency in those fees. And they also create some employment. They are largely, most of the hunting fees are generally earmarked for conservation through employing game guards. So there's an understanding that a lot of the fees that come out of hunting are to employ game guards to then safeguard the wildlife. And they also supply for conservancy operating costs. But this is a rather underrated and very important factor, which has a greater felt value than people might imagine, and that's meat. Most conservancy members will get access to meat, and very often that is the only tangible benefit that they will feel immediately, rather than a social benefit like a clinic, that they will feel that arrives at their doorstep. So there's very often a very close association with meat, and this, in the context of Namibia at least, underlies some of the importance of hunting. An analysis was done by our partners at NAXO on the financial viabilities of conservancies based on their income and their current operating costs. And with hunting, the majority of the conservancies studied, these are ones that have joint venture operations, the others don't necessarily have business operations. Together with hunting, most of them are viable. There's a couple that are teetering, the sort of ones in yellow that are drifting in and out of being viable, but generally are keeping their heads above water. When you switch across to without hunting, there's a couple of things that stand out. There's these conservancies here. This is the 9I one that relies largely on elephant hunting and their neighbors. They fall away, and they start to face major issues. But there are those that live and are driven off tourism that you can see over here, and some of them are more or less exclusively tourism, like this one here, Twyfelfontein, with the White Lady Lodge, with the rock engravings and stuff, and they've got unique selling points. So this it shows you that you need more options than simply photographic tourism. It's not the panacea. It's certainly not in the case of Namibia. It's not the panacea for everything. And the situation in the Kaza region and in the Zambezi region of Namibia is even more stark. And this simply relates to elephants and trophy hunting of elephants, to be rather blunt and specific about it. Elephant trophy hunting makes sense for those conservancies. Without it, they all become financially unviable, and by a magnitude that they would face enormous difficulties. So to conclude, we have 20% of Namibia under community conservation. As I've said, there's a number of, despite some of the challenges, there's a number of conservancies that want to join. There are lots of institutional challenges. There's fraud, embezzlement, all of these things that are normal in society are certainly taking place. But the overall momentum is very, very positive. It's the result of long-term investments, but it's also the result of having diversified options. And part of our challenge is to diversify beyond simply photographic tourism and hunting, to start to look at other venues that might provide returns. For example, with fish, we're looking at more of a food security angle, where the conservancies will invest in getting fish numbers in the rivers which have been decimated, getting the fish numbers up as a benefit to every person in that conservancy, that they can have the ability to go and fish, both for food and as a cultural expression, as well as for recreation. So these are part of the diversification options that we're looking at. Conservancies are associated with increasing natural resource and financial returns, particularly those ones that are maturing, and that's why there's a waiting list to get in. And this is likely to continue to provide returns on investment. There's more partners that want to be part of it. So, especially in the context of Namibia's limited financial resources, this ability of the CBNRM program to privately to attract private finance, which has a certain sustainability built into it, on large portions of the land is particularly relevant, and I think a good conservation success story. And that's it. I must thank all our partners, and that's the website that I referred to, where there's an enormous wealth of information, a lot of which I've pilfered for this presentation from our partners in NAXO. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Angus. It's fascinating. That's such a remarkable increase in communal conservancies over the past few years. And then, as you say, something's clearly working, but despite the challenges, and trying to figure out how to make that bridge between the investment phase and the actual return phase through diversification seems to be particularly key here. Not only that, but your rather clear position on whether hunting and culling encourages or discourages conservation. I always find that to be an interesting talking point, since most of the world's major conservation organizations were, maybe not most, but many, were based on the interests of hunters, including, say, IUCN. So on behalf of the global audience, Jorge and Angus, I want to thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We very much appreciate it. It's a fascinating discussion. And I believe those who want to have the possibility to follow up with either of you with further questions and discussion. So we look forward to extending these discussions further and on to the next webinar on the 14th of February. And I thank you again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.